Welcome back to my studio at Visual Philosophy. This series is going to be called Dana's Aesthetics, and what I want to do is just to start to give you an idea of how I make decisions that affect how my artwork turns out. So I will take you through different media, encaustic painting, printmaking, watercolor painting, different materials, and talk about the design qualities, the formal elements, how all these decisions fit together to make a painting like this one. Why do I choose certain colors? Why do I choose certain shapes? How do I make those decisions? Why do I incorporate abstracted imagery versus representational imagery? Just to try to give you more of a behind the scenes as to why I'm doing that. I know I've showed you a lot of technical tutorials and things explaining how to create an image using different techniques. I want to talk about these formal design qualities that are really universal and that every artist uses in their artwork, whether they're a two-dimensional artist or a three-dimensional artist, a painter, a printmaker. All these elements really work together in similar ways. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about right off the bat was, the difference between representational art and abstract art. And I have a whole video on the definition of why these two terms are so different, so you can watch that if you're interested. But because I use different types of imagery, some of them are representational, some of them are abstracted, I kind of wanted to talk about how those play out in a painting or in a two-dimensional work. Because I am a two-dimensional artist, I work flat on a pictorial plane, so there's different formal and design qualities that go into how I lay out that picture plane. And when we're talking about abstracted imagery, we're really talking about those design elements in their most basic form. So for instance, in this painting, I have circles, ovals, little circles. I have color, I have some line. I might be adding more line. We'll talk about that later. But those are all those design elements, and I'll go through those in this series. But how do I think and how do I want it to come out? I get asked a lot, if you're working representationally, you have an idea of how you want it to come out, whether that's a still life and you do your own setup, or you're out in the landscape and so you're trying to make it look, at least resemble what you're looking at. And that's a really important skill, learning how to draw, learning how to see, learning how to represent something in 3 dimensions and transfer it into 2 dimensions. But what if you don't always want to do that, or you want to do both? So for instance, in this painting, I have a fan here, which is a representational image. I have a photograph of like a medieval tower, and then I have some abstracted colors and shapes. Why did I choose to do that? And how did these two correlate between each other? And the goal for me when I use abstracted imagery, in other words, shapes, colors, lines, is that I'm trying to create feelings and I'm trying to evoke ideas that aren't necessarily representational. So yes, you can look at an image and feel something, or you could be transported to a space, or you can have a memory triggered, which is all the things that I like to do with representational imagery. But when you move beyond that and you abstract those ideas and you try to put into physical form or visual form ideas and things that aren't tangible, then it becomes a little more difficult, and you have to rely on your own inner feelings, your own ideas, and those design elements. So we'll talk a lot about that. and we'll talk about the symbols that I've created and think about for my own visual vocabulary. In other words, these shapes and lines and symbols that represent things that are important to me. And of course, as an artist, if you're watching this, you might have your own symbols and ideas and vocabulary that represents you. And so I'm just going to talk about mine and how I came, to these different abstracted symbols and why I use the things that I do. Okay, so here we have two encaustic paintings, two similar sizes, similar media, but two very different images. And I want to talk about how I make decisions and how the design elements and formal qualities of two-dimensional art, that language, that grammar of two-dimensional art, plays a role in my decision-making process on how I created these pieces. And they're not finished, which is why I chose to talk about them for this series, because I don't feel like they're totally resolved. So it's good to kind of talk through where they are now and how I want them to end up. Because the way that I work, I don't usually have a real clear idea of how I want a piece to wind up. For instance, we'll take this one first. I started out just with a bare wood panel, and I put a layer of encaustic down, and then I started to add some color. And this bottom layer here that had white and blue, I wanted to try a new technique that I don't often use. You'll see a lot of my work has this kind of rigid brush strokes that are more geometric. So using the brush, like the width of the brush, and you can see that limits the stroke that I can get. So I need different size brushes if I want a smaller stroke and so on. But I wanted to see how I could get different textures. So one of the formal elements that visual art is bound by is texture. And not just a physical texture, like this encaustic paint is smooth, which also plays a role in how we view it, but the texture that's sort of alluded to, so the implied texture. This texture of the print has that rigidness, that sort of line roughness, indicative of a woodcut that's been printed on some paper. That's more textural, and then this has more of a flowy, kind of watery texture. So I wanted to get a contrast between the two. So I knew I wanted to work with this piece and having some other texture that was different, or contrast, which is one of the kind of formal or design principles, I should say. So there's principles and there's elements. And the elements, like we were mentioning before, are shape and line, texture, color, value. The principles are the things that are more intangible, that work together, that your eye sees, that your eye implies, things like contrast. So when a piece has a vast difference between values, so it's got a light value next to a really dark value, that creates contrast. And these are things that can be applied to a lot of different elements. So for instance, the value contrast or the texture contrast. I can apply that principle to different elements. And the more I use those in conjunction with each other, the more dynamic a piece is. So this one has contrast between value, has contrast between texture, it has contrast between color. There's blue and orange, which are complements on the color wheel. So right off the bat, there's 3 different contrasts that are really making your eye kind of go boom, boom, boom. And I really like that in artwork. I'm really drawn to using those contrasts because I think it helps guide a viewer around a two-dimensional picture plane, and it also kind of provides a rhythm. So a rhythm is one of those principles that I use, And rhythm and pattern kind of go together. And if you think about music, you can understand that a rhythm is the beat. So it's, 3/4 time or 4/4 time. That's the steadiness and the timing of the piece. So a rhythm is the way that pieces are placed next to each other in a piece, whether you have repetition, whether you have, space and rest. Those are all parts of the rhythm of a visual piece. So here I have really small kind of pattern that creates a very tight rhythm. And then I have larger pieces that you can kind of skip gently across, and that creates more of a flowing rhythm. And then I have these more similar shapes that are in a pattern using this stencil, and that creates more of a stable rhythm. So again, I have all these different rhythms that contrast with each other and create that flow within the painting. And that's what I really, really like. And in encaustic, you can get a lot of different textures, you can get a lot of different patterns, you can get a lot of different colored choices. And I like to have that dynamic, those dynamic contrasts. So when we're talking about the objectives of the painting, in abstracted artworks, what I'm really trying to do is create a sense of movement, create a sense that you as the viewer, want to look more. You want to see more. You want to understand what's happening. So it's not just about, oh, this is a landscape. That's very straightforward. Maybe you don't know where the landscape is. Maybe you're really drawn to it. Maybe you don't like it. In representational art, it's all about kind of the thing that you're representing, that picture, that illusion. With abstracted art, it's more about how these elements and principles work together to create feelings, to create memories, to create a story that isn't necessarily revealed very easily. So it's more about interpretation, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, and then how you as the viewer interpret my decisions when you look at it. So let's just do a comparison, and then I think that'll be enough for today. But when you compare these two paintings, right off the bat, I see that the color doesn't have as much contrast in this painting. So where we talked about the complementary colors in this one, there's blue and orange. This one really has an analogous color scheme. So it's blues and a little bit of purples and grays, and it's really more calming, right? There's blue in here, but because it's paired with that bright orange, that sort of coral color, it's a lot more jarring. You get a sense of like a push and pull in space, and you're kind of bounced around more than this one. You kind of settle in. And so I think about that when I'm creating these pieces and what will create contrast where there isn't contrast. So instead of using color, maybe I'll use the contrast of abstracted shapes versus representational shapes. Or I'll use the space. So I'll bury some of these deeper, softer colors in the background with layers of encaustic paint, which is really easy to do. And then I'll put more of a texture that's very visible and physical on the surface. You can actually feel that physical texture. And so it really separates and draws your eye to that section because it's much different, right? They have two different qualities. So these are, again, some of the things that I'm thinking about, but still trying to get that movement. So how do I take your eye from, say, here all the way over here, and then back to here, and then back through here? And then around here. I mean, all the ways that I place objects. So this one kind of running off the edge, but then that blue catches your eye because it's a high contrast between the bright blue and the white, sends you back over here so that you keep coming back and seeing more and really wanting to dive in. That's really what I'm trying to do and what good art really does. So thanks for joining me, and I hope that this series will enlighten you not only into my own work, but also into two-dimensional art in general and how artists lay out their paintings, their prints, their artwork.